I'd like to ask you about the DOJ's failure to coordinate the zero tolerance policy with any of the U.S. Marshal Service. You could just explain very briefly, I know you have, what the zero tolerance policy was and how broad it was.
So the zero tolerance policy is announced in April 2018, required U.S. attorneys along the southwest border to prosecute all illegal entry cases or attempted illegal entry cases referred to them by the Department of Homeland Security, even if they were misdemeanor violations. So the intent was prosecute every single case, misdemeanor or felony.
Can you give us an example of things, misdemeanors that were prosecuted? I mean, things that we've never done this before, right, in our country's history, but what were examples of misdemeanors that started to get prosecuted?
So the difference between the misdemeanor and the felony, it is a misdemeanor to seek to cross the border illegally or to actually cross the border illegally in the absence of any aggravating factors, such as if you don't have a prior felony or a prior conviction, if you're not carrying drugs or guns or other paraphernalia, if you are simply crossing the border illegally without any of those other overlays, that's a misdemeanor. Traditionally, those cases were handled through the administrative deportation process, not the criminal process. There were exceptions, there were occasions through certain efforts to seek to do those over the years, but those were the exceptions rather than the rule.
So basically, I mean, what you're saying is under the Reagan administration or the Bush administration, the other Bush administration, these cases, it wasn't the blanket prosecution of everyone who came across the borders. And what the Trump administration basically did was blanket prosecution. If you come across the border, you're going to be prosecuted. Is that a fair?
That's my general understanding. There could have been exceptions for particular U.S. attorneys in particular unique circumstances, but our general understanding is that that was generally the case.
Now, when you're going to take such a move as overturning precedent that Reagan and Clinton and Bush's had set up and call for blanket prosecution, did they consult the U.S. Marshals Service when they took this decision?
They did not in advance of announcing the policy in April 2018.
And that's odd, right? Because the U.S. Marshal Service is going to be, as part of the Department of Justice, and they would be responsible for implementing this. Wouldn't you want to know what kind of burden this is going to put on your Marshal Service?
It's critical. The Marshals take custody of the defendant, and they have to find a place for that defendant to have a jail cell. They're taken into the custody of the Justice Department through the Marshal Service. The Justice Department has a limited number of jail cells, and if you're going to add hundreds of new defendants in each district, they've got to find places for those individuals. And as we detail here, it resulted in requiring them to triple bunk inmates in some instances, and it ended up resulting in a $200+ million shortfall for the Marshal Service.
What I found most shocking about your report is, though, they had no conversations, no discussions, correct?
That's correct, in advance of that April announcement.
And the Marshal Service found in an assessment that they would continue to provide a best level effort to comply, but there would inevitably be, quote, a degradation of service and security. Inspector General Horowitze, what is meant by a degradation of service and security?
So the impact on the Marshal Service, in addition to having to find bed space for the additional defendants, they also need marshals to help manage those defendants, right, and take them into custody and do all the processing. That meant pulling people off of other job responsibilities, which has a cascading effect on, as we noted here through various documents, we saw the Marshal Service ability to continue to go out and execute arrest warrants, which is a core Marshal Service function.
Would you actually say it made us less secure as a country because of it diverting Marshals' resources away from things that were critical?
Well, as we outline here, that's certainly what the Marshals expressed concern about, precisely that issue.
And that's because of the zero tolerance policy, correct?
That was one of the impacts on them of the zero tolerance policy.
The U.S. most about protecting us more than politicians are saying the zero tolerance policy wasn't just inhumane with the bed issue, but actually made our country less secure from their perspective.
Again, that's what we found in the records of the Marshal Service and what we were told by the Marshal Service.
And last question: they have a $210 million deficit today. Is that also because of the zero tolerance policy?
So they had a $227 million or so hole in their budget back in the 2018, 2019 time period, Congress had to do an emergency appropriation for them, and the department had to reprogram other monies to make up for that hole in their budget so that they could pay their costs.
Thank you.